think we can go ahead and get started. So thank you all for joining our Microsoft Excel training session 2. The overall goal for this is, continuing education and just general skill development for a lot of us. I know in the public health sector especially, we have large barriers for cost for purchasing advanced data software. And, I really do think that we can do a lot, if not everything, in Microsoft Excel. So briefly, here's an overview of our agenda of what we're going to go over today. We are primarily going to focus on our formulas because I had some requests to do more of a deep dive on the formula aspect of this. And I think, once we get into that, you'll all see why that's, so coveted. But we will cover conditional formatting and some different applications for that. Pivot tables, which if you're doing something, just once with a complete data set, can be a great alternative to writing a formula. We can also cover why you might want to do a pivot table versus a formula. And then time permitting, I did want to cover some different graphs, linking it to your pivot tables and showing some different options for graphs for our public's perspective. Okay. So a little bit different from our first training session, we are going to have a PowerPoint presentation just brought up briefly so that we can more easily timestamp this. So don't be don't be discouraged that there's a PowerPoint on screen right now because it's not going to stay there for very long. Okay, so with conditional formatting, it truly breaks down to preference and usability, depending on how you want to do your conditional formatting and what different applications you want to apply with it. For the most part, conditional formatting is used to apply rules to things, which can be anything from highlighting certain values that are greater than, less than, between, equal to, specific text containing any dates occurring, duplicate values. I'd say duplicates are probably some of the most common that you're going to see being used with conditional formatting. So they do have Excel does have some built-in options that you can see here. Your top 10, if you were trying to look at a string variable for, well, I guess a good string variable is the number of doses of COVID vaccine that individuals have received. You can also do your top 10%, your bottom 10%. That way you're not trying to do any additional analysis. All those types of things are built in for you. But you can also do a built-in, like create a new value yourself by doing essentially a mild formula within conditional formatting itself. So once you hit new under conditional formatting, it gives you several different options. You can format all cells based on their values. I'll be honest, this is the one I use the most, is format only cells that contain. And I think this is probably the most applicable if you're not going to be using one of the default settings. You can base it on cell value. So you would use cell value if it's a non-nominal variable. So anything like a number, values that are going to be arranged, so like dates, things of that nature. Specific text, so anything that if you wanted to look for, like in our spreadsheet here that we have, a specific county name, if you wanted to code all of those a certain color, that would be a way that you can do that. So for this example, I would select whatever range I want it to populate before creating my rule. Sorry, people continue to join, so I'm continuing having to admit people. I think in the future, I'm going to have to make somebody at Wood County that attends these administrators while to assist with that. But we select our range first. We would hit new rule, format only cells that contain. I would do specific text, and then I could do something like, we'll do wood. And then to format it specifically how I want it formatted, You can change the fonts. You can change, for most people, we're going to be just changing the fill. I like purple, so we're going to change it to purple. You can, however, change the font color as well, because black might not show up well on purple, so you might have to change multiple things. So I can change it to white, and then once I hit OK, you can see it automatically populates. So some of the applications of why you would want to have conditional formatting built into your spreadsheets are, now I can sort by color. This becomes applicable in different settings, depending on how you're using it and your preference. Obviously, with something like wood, I could have just filtered by ABC order, or I could have even unselected all my variables and then just hit wood. There are different applications when you might want to be doing color coding. For example, if you're going to have different categories, if things meet certain criteria or not, you can have it code more aggressively with conditional formatting. And again, it really does boil down to preference. You can do the same thing with color scales. If you end up messing up a rule, you can always go to clear rules and clear for the entire sheet. If you're unsure where your rules are and you don't want to delete everything, if you go to manage rules, if I had conditional formatting in a spreadsheet, it would actually show it. So over here, this is a decoded or a de-identified version of our Excel or of our COVID cases in Wood County. So I went through this and removed everyone's identifiers. But if I go into my manage rules here, apparently I don't have any because I deleted everyone's names. But you can set up conditional formatting to code individuals who have duplicate names and date of birth. So that way we can more easily identify a laundry list of names. You can code to result as a purple color or something like that. And if anyone has questions about conditional formatting, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because, again, I don't think that's going to be the meat of what we're going to talk about today. But something like ODRS cases like COVID, where individuals can test positive multiple times, you can highlight duplicate values and then highlight individuals with common first name, last name, and date of birth. Because obviously it's possible for individuals to have very similar names, especially if you have a very common name, like John Smith is a good example. How many John Smiths are there in the world? Probably a lot. So that's one application for something like that. This is actually the example from our PowerPoint here. This is I highlighted duplicate values, and you can get pretty fancy with your fill effects, which is fun. So if you want to be somebody that color codes it real pretty with purple and blues like I did here, then that's also something you can play with. It also helps if you're going to be sharing data. Conditional formatting can be used to format your analysis that you populate in the long run too. But moving right along to pivot tables, our next, and I think probably one of the most valuable things that you can do in Microsoft Excel. I'm going to teach you guys how to create one and keep it up to date, which we did cover during the first session, but so I'll do a quick review of that. I'll show you how to change the calculation within the pivot table. There's a number of different ones, but I'm going to focus mainly on the sum, the count, the average, and the applied use. For those of us that went through some statistics training, probably biostats more specifically, you definitely are familiar with like the 2x2 tables. This pivot tables are not limited to a 2x2 table. But again, for local public health, I do think that's probably one of the most applicable uses. If you're not familiar with 2x2 tables, I'll go through some examples that I think are going to help clarify that. So don't fret. I'll teach you how to apply different filters, maybe even multiple filters, and then how to do groupings for certain variables such as age and things like that. Okay. So we do have our data set here. And I did already create the pivot table, but I am going to show you guys how to cover that again. So when you have a data spreadsheet and you need to create a pivot table from scratch, as long as you're clicked anywhere within your data set, the first thing you do is you go up to Insert and hit Pivot Table, and then Pivot Table from Range. This is a brand new version of Excel. So it's gonna maybe look a little bit different than your guys. I just got it the other day, so it might have some additional bells and whistles, and it might even have some things removed because Microsoft does, fluctuate. But once you create your initial pivot table, the first thing it's going to show you is to select table or a range. If you are going to be adding to your data set that you're creating this pivot table, so like COVID, I know a lot of us still do regular COVID data updates. Maybe we're sharing information to our public or with our leadership. And an example like that, where you're going to be continually adding rows as you go, it's going to populate by default the range from where your first variable is set to where your last variable is set. So you can see, if you don't know how to read the Excel formula, this essentially says column A1 through AJ, which is all the way left to right, and then it goes from A1 down to AJ 194. So it covers the entirety of the data. However, again, if you're going to be adding to this, the first thing I would do is click your upload arrow, scroll back to column A, and then click and drag every column that you have data in currently. And this will make it look like this. Instead of having the numbers, it will just have A through AJ. Essentially, that extends your pivot table out to as far as Excel can go, which is like over 10 million. So when you populate a table, now it includes your data. So if you update this in a week or 2 weeks with new data from ODRS or from a survey system, all you have to do is go back to this and hit refresh, and it'll have your data updated for you. I am going to delete this tab because we already have one of these created for us, which is great. So again, if I do dump new data in, the first thing I'll do is always hit refresh. And when you start with a blank pivot table, it will initially just look like this. And when you're clicked out of the pivot table, you'll see that that column over to our right disappears. So first, by initially clicking into, sorry, I got to pull this up and get it out of the way. Okay. So within our pivot table, the first thing we want to do is creating it and keeping it up to date, which we already went over. But the next thing is how we change our calculations. So depending on what variables we use, it will default to a number of different things. So we're going to look at vaccinated individuals over by the number of doses, and then we want it to sum the number of doses, right? So you can see in this bottomest, the sigma values, this is essentially our calculated values. So this is asking us, based on our row variables and our column variables, how we want it to count. There may be times, depending on the variables you dump over here, that it populates this to sum, which is probably not what you want for most circumstances. So right now, this is essentially telling me that there are people who answered no for being vaccinated, and they have 3 people with 1 dose. I don't want it to do the sum. I want this to do a count. So by changing it to that, we get a more accurate representation of our data, which now includes. Okay, sorry, we are going to mute you. Okay. If you are not already muted, please double check and make sure that you are. Thank you. So now our pivot table is telling us that the number of individuals who are vaccinated and how many doses they've had appropriately. So we have, these individuals that are vaccinated with 1 dose, 14 doses, 29 doses, or 4. So we have, with our yeses, essentially this is saying we have 4 individuals that have had 1 dose. We have 30 individuals that have had 2. We have 38 individuals that have had 3, and we have 5 individuals that have had 4. This is falsified data, so if the no's are kind of not making sense, then that totally makes sense. But what I really wanted to take from this is when you populate data for something like vaccinated doses. And if we change this back to some, obviously 0 can't have a sum. So if we go back and look at our actual data set for that variable, here we go. We know that we have obviously zeros in here, so it shouldn't be 0. So it can't sum a 0 for us. So we know that that automatically is just incorrect. So by changing that to our count, that corrects that portion of the pivot table for us. There are options besides count and sum. You can have it do average. You can have it do max, minimum, product. You can have it count numbers. If you're familiar with standard deviation, you can certainly have it do that. It will do variance as well. Those are more complicated than I think they're worth explaining. I really do think that you're most commonly going to be using sum or count, possibly average. But again, I think these two are going to just essentially give you what you really need the most. You can also change it to max and min, just to look at that. For something like this variable, it's not going to be returning anything, that beneficial for us. So we're gonna go back and change that to count. So another application for something like this is applying filters to our variables, right? So a big question that we got, and unfortunately I am going to focus a lot on COVID data because that's my most in-depth data set, but I can definitely talk about other applications like, foodborne outbreaks or something like that, and how we can apply pivot tables. But let's say we got a public records request for the number of individuals who died from COVID and were fully vaccinated, right? So by looking at our vaccinated information, we would need our died, and we would need our doses for something like that. So you can probably already guess that the pivot table is going to start to look overly complicated. If I were to do something like this, right? This is not exactly easy to read. So one way to quickly alleviate that is actually by taking one of our filter variables up into our filters column or section. And then within our pivot table, we can go up to this drop down arrow and hit select multiple. And I only want my vaccinated individuals, right? Because that was what I was requested to pull. And because I know I don't care if they didn't die, essentially, I can unselect no. And if they're blank, then it's an understood no for most circumstances. So this does get a little bit more complicated, unfortunately, with doses and manufacturer, because again, depending on the vaccine manufacturer you got, you may or may not have been fully vaccinated. But this can help us more quickly narrow down that we have possibly 48 out of our 67 were possibly fully vaccinated, and likely fully vaccinated. And then we can narrow it down even further that received 1 or possibly 2 boosters. You can continue to make this pivot table work for you by tossing in vaccine manufacturer. So that'll give you your J&J, by your doses, your Moderna, by your doses, and your Pfizer, by your doses. It also helps. Unfortunately, pivot tables always default to having blank values, especially when we have our pivot table extending out like we did when we initially selected our range. If you select it, like I showed you, where you select columns A through AJ for our example data sheet, it's always going to have those blanks, but it's quickly turned off by going to column labels and unselecting blanks. So that does help narrow it down just a little bit more. So from this, we know that anybody who received a J&J shot, at least 1 dose by the ACIP standard, is considered fully vaccinated. We know that the Moderna, anything 2 or more, is considered fully vaccinated. Technically, it always depends on the date, right? We also need the 14 days out. But then the same thing with Pfizer. Now we have individuals that appear to be fully vaccinated. You can further complicate this by throwing in the date. And I'm showing you kind of why you'll get away from pivot tables if you're doing more complex analysis, and why you move into formulas. So this is a perfectly fine way to do it. You can continue to go through a pivot table with continually adding variables, adding dates. I can toss guide up into here to clarify it even more. By moving it up into filters, it removes one of those ugly variables that we have. You'll notice when I dumped in the last vaccination dose date, it did populate it into years, quarters by default. Most of the time, you're probably not going to want quarters, but it might also not do this depending on the version of Excel you have. More or less, it's going to look like this when you dump a date filter in. So if you're only, let's say you got the public records request and you only want your data for the last 3 months, like they're focusing on only when X variant became the dominant strain, right? You can do this with any variable set, but if you right click within the pivot table on the variable set that you're focusing on, in this example, the date of last vaccination dose, and by hitting group, you can actually select how you would like it to group. So if you have multiple years worth of data, you are unfortunately going to want years and months. You can even start it from a range, so you can have it something up like this. And let's say we just wanted the last couple months, so we would do 5/1/2022 and let it end there. Now it breaks it down, and we don't want anything before that, right? So I can remove that. You can actually just turn it off. And then now we're only focusing on our last 3 months. I can smell smoke coming out of people's ears because I know that's a very condensed and pretty specific line of thinking when it comes to data analysis. Again, remember these are recorded. They're going to be timestamped on YouTube for review. So we can definitely go back through these. So pivot tables are a great way that you can do some obviously complex analysis, right? Why I would advocate not using them as opposed to why I would use them is the more complex analysis you get, the more easy this becomes to mess up. And unfortunately, if you continually add data to it, you have to clean that data every single time. It's not very automated. It's going to be a little bit more labor intensive. Now, if you're doing something like an annual report on vaccination data or something like that that you're getting from Impact or from ODH or from the secure data warehouse, working with, I'll call it dead data that is no longer being updated and maintained, pivot tables are a great tool. But as you continually add data to your system and you're doing more complex analysis, anytime there's more than 1 or 2 variables by your column rows, when your section starts to look like this, it's certainly okay to continue to do, but I would advocate for moving away from it. And I would advocate to moving towards something more like formulas, which is where we are going to get into next and spend the majority of our time now. This is the key to automating your data. There's a right way, a wrong way, and my way when it comes to formulas. And what I mean by that is you will find dozens of different examples within Excel forums, on YouTube, within your own health department with how people use and implement these different formulas. And all of them are correct. It's just whichever way you do it, you should be consistent with. And if it makes sense to you and you're being consistent with it 9 times out of 10, as long as you're doing the right analysis in the first place, you're going to be correct. Consistency is very, very important when it comes to any type of data analysis. I think this formula is extremely underrated, and I'll show you why from viewing a lot of our Northwest regional partners and how we share data. Just updating and maintaining those graphs and tables on a regular basis is super labor intensive. So this concatenate, I probably butchered that, is a great formula that we're going to use. Assigning categorical variables with names, VLOOKUP and how we can use that. For all my epis in the room that are interested in syndromic surveillance, this can be a super valuable tool, as will if, count if s, and name manager kind of ties back to assigning categorical variables. Okay, so moving away from our pivot tables. The first thing is our concatenate. So let's say on a regular basis, you are updating your hospitalizations for a given disease by age group, and you have this essentially tied to a table or a graph that you publish on a regular basis. You can actually use this formula to calculate and combine to populate information for you. So the formula that you see here in this bar is written to formulate this variable, and the same with this and for total. So female and male and total is all broken down. And I know this seems silly, but when you have a variable that's always going to be moving, like this 481 or the 596, updating this to reflect into a graph or into a table does take time. And if you can automate it with this process once, you never have to do it again. So if it's something you're doing on a daily or a weekly or even a monthly basis, it really helps for that. It also helps if it's something that you're not maintaining for a certain period of time because you got, taken away to do another portion of your job, such as an outbreak investigation. Now you come back and all you have to do is dump your raw data. And if you formulate things like this properly, you don't have to worry about trying to update it again. There's a lot of ways that you can apply this across the public health system with information sharing perspectives. There are formulas such as using the count if s, where we could also populate our age counts for these different variables. And I will show you some examples of how we can do that. But I'm going to pull up another spreadsheet here to show you some new ways that we can apply these types of things. So this is my all-time COVID cases, and they are tied to these graphs. So it breaks it down by age group, and it breaks it down directly by the demographic variable as well. So it tells me my total for my females, my total for my males, and that's directly tied over here. You can obviously include total too, but for the most purposes, you're not going to be doing that. But if I were to change this number here, I guess I need to change. Let's say 2000, so you can see that it's going to be a drastic change. It automatically changes it for me within the spread, within my graph. So that's one application to this type of formula where you're going to be working with variables within a graph. This is not something that I ever actually applied the count if formula to for this graph. This is actually, I would use my pivot table to get my cases by age group, which you can also break down and then copy the data over into this. You can link within a pivot table. The only problem with that is, sorry, we're going to go back to our other spreadsheet. So for something like this, the reason I was using that formula as opposed to something like a pivot table is if I were to toss in, that's a great example. So you can see that age does not populate fully correct right there. So you're going to go through another instance that you might unfortunately run into when you find a patient's age and you're trying to populate it. This is listed as a date variable. So within my pivot table, it was showing an incorrect age. And I left some of these, I guess, issues in on purpose so that hopefully if it's something that happens to you, you'll remember that this is how you fix it. But if you come over into here and it says age, or for the age column, it is categorizing it as a date variable, which is obviously not correct. So if we change this to an age, it now populates it out to the nearest decimal point. And this will happen depending on the source you're using and how you're downloading your variables. To get rid of those and make it round up or down, you simply can click this after changing it to a number. Usually you're going to want to decrease it for age. You don't want a full, option like that. And then by clicking refresh, oh. Well, I have egg on my face, don't I? Because it's not exactly fixing itself. So we'll try, one more fix here. See if we can get that to work. Well, unfortunately, my age is not gonna work for me here. Apologies if you can hear that drilling in the background. We still have construction going on. Tell you what, we'll go back over into this pivot table that I know actually works. Okay. Okay. So you can group by any age category. So if you want to group within this, starting at 65 by 10s, you can certainly do that. You can also start at 1 and do it by 10 by unselecting this and then just picking so you want to do it by 20s. It'll group it for you by 20s. Is essentially what I was trying to prove with pivot tables. I apologize that sheet that we were working from was not correctly up to date. Okay, so that is how you could apply the concatenate formula to your graphs and to your automated processes when you're doing some of these different updates. And that can be applied for any number of different things. It doesn't have to be something like a graph. It could be used for a table that you're going to be regularly updating and maintaining. So going back to our formulas, I did include in the sample sheet sent out some, very basic purposes as well as a complicated formula. And I tried to include some version of a simple formula for that as well. So for VLOOKUP, we're looking that if values match, then you can return a value from a specific column. So this is a relatively complicated version of a formula that can be more advanced or more simplistic depending on your knowledge of the formula itself. So looking at something from the Ohio Department of Health's COVID vaccine data dashboard, you are able to download complete, boosted, second boosted, and even the up-to-date bivalent vaccination by date. Unfortunately, you cannot download these by age group. But with this information in mind, if you download that data and paste it into a sheet like this with the corresponding dates, which are available when you download it, essentially it looks like this when it downloads. This has been cleaned up a little bit. I can then use, we have somebody joining again. Okay. I can use a formula like this, that if my dates match here compared to the vaccine data checkup tab that I showed you before, I can ask it to return column 6. So for something like vaccine complete, if I go back to here, it's essentially counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is a cumulative sum by this corresponding date. So how this helps benefit is once you set it up, I download data, I dump it into this spreadsheet. I can go back to my overall tab. I can click and drag my dates down. As long as it matches the date in my D column, it will populate a value for me for those variables or the most recent variable available. So you can see this goes up to January 5th, and it's a sliding scale. So you, again, don't have to use it to continually update data. Again, I know that this is a relatively advanced example. You can use VLOOKUP for more simplistic things as well. But again, the general purpose of it is if you're trying to find points that match and you want to return a specific variable if the data matches, you can use your VLOOKUP formula. And you can use it for any number of variables. So you'll see like this says AM12. This is looking at a range between columns A and M, and it's going to select the 12th column out of that if the variables match. You can use that for something like syndromic surveillance as well. If you're downloading data from ODRS and you want to populate 5 years worth of data for influenza-associated hospitalizations based on the MMWR week, then you can do that in real time with that formula. Again, once the formula is set up correctly, it will be an automated process. And yes, it is extremely labor intensive initially. But once you learn this system, it becomes second nature and you'll work from it very, very quickly. So this is our influenza tracker, for example. This creates a composite for the 5-year baseline using the CDC and ODH approved influenza threshold variables. So it includes the IAH and the syndromic information, and it applies the current year to a 5-year baseline. So if we go and look at this, we can use a COUNTIFS or even a VLOOKUP, depending how you set it up, because again, there's a number of ways to do this, to calculate how many of a specific variable exist, given that the date matches the date to the left here. And that'll make more sense when I talk about our naming columns. So I guess I jumped a little bit ahead there. Let's go back to our example sheet. And I did cover naming a little bit. But before we get into the if and the if-else, I think naming and how to manage those names is appropriate to do. So if you select any column, you will typically get this in your name box to the left. It's just going to give you the C1, A1, whatever's normally assigned. But if you see here, this doesn't say A1, it says case ID. It's a very easy thing to assign names. And the reason you would do this is if you're working with a large data set, and this is a great example of a large data set where I don't know what columns I'm working from, you can assign names to make it more easily used to populate your data into a formula. So something like case ID or collector ID. So this at this point has been unnamed. So to initially name a variable, you select the row or the column, I'm sorry, go up into your name box, and then you would simply name it whatever you want it to be called. So collector ID, hit enter. Oh, I'm sorry, you cannot have spaces. So if you want to have a space, you have to use an underscore. So that was the issue there. And you can do the same thing with all these other variables. The majority of these already have names. So for something like sex, if I'm working out of a blank sheet and I wanted to get the sex, let's do female count, right? If I do equal COUNTIFS, and once my criteria range, this is where I could type in sex. And if you've assigned a name, once you type in here, you'll see that it will populate like that. And then Excel's really good at helping you write a formula. So you can see once I have criteria 1 selected, I would just hit my comma, to get to my next criteria 1. So my range is sex. For this, I want to know how many are female. And then I simply close it, and it automatically counts how many female I have. Now let's say I wanted to do the male. It's essentially the exact same thing. So don't reinvent the wheel. Just copy that down, and you can just go back into this and have male, and now you have your accurate count. So this is an example of something that you could certainly do within a pivot table. Right? It has that broken down pretty quickly. But it gets more and more complicated the more that we add to this. And for the more complex variable, I'll start with something like this. So this is from our enteric tracker. So a formula like this is going to count if the dates match, which is, this is my criteria range 1. This is my criteria 1. This is criteria 2, and this is criteria range 2. This can extend as long as you keep writing it. You can have criteria 1 through 99. So to show you something where this becomes more applicable, besides just counting, you could have your number of males or females between the ages of 5 and 10. You can have it calculate how many individuals received certain vaccines. This is a great way to get rapid frequency distribution data. And the more complex it gets, the more applicable it becomes to do a formula as opposed to a pivot table. So looking at our big data sheet, looking at our vaccination status. So this is a formula that I wrote because we had a lot of requests for our leadership to help us understand our COVID cases based on the criteria: is a person not vaccinated, partially vaccinated, fully vaccinated, but not, or I'm sorry, complete vaccination, but not fully vaccinated, fully vaccinated, not boosted, fully vaccinated, boosted, second boosted, and then even the availability to detect a bivalent vaccine. So you can see this formula for vaccination status. This is how complicated an if or a count if can get. When you're using something like a count if, you'll be returning an actual count of something. Now, if you're using if, it's going to assign a category based on other things. So focusing on something like vaccination status, this formula goes through every vaccine manufacturer choice that we have, the number of doses required, whether from 0 all the way up to greater than 4 or greater than 3, I think is as far as this one goes. The vaccinated days, which is another formula calculated to give the difference between illness onset and the event date, or I'm sorry, the illness onset and the date of last vaccination. And then if all of this criteria is met, it will return the fully vaccinated, up to date, not boosted, because that's what this criteria sends, it tells it to do. So that is how complicated, that is how complicated that can get. But you can also use it for much more simplistic things. Like our count fs is simply just giving me the number of yeses that exist between our underlying health conditions. So it's a selected range. That's why we're using count fs. And then I want all the yeses assigned to that so that I can get how many underlying health conditions we had for a case. You can also use a formula like this, or like with the if function, to tell you how many bivalent shots you have. Again, if you're downloading the right variables and you understand those, this essentially tells me that the individual has received The correct number of doses is of the appropriate age and receive their vaccine after the date that their age was eligible to receive the vaccine so that they can be considered a bivalent dose. Because at this point, there's no option in ODRS to mark that, right? So this is another option where you can use an if function to give you plausible evidence, because if the vaccination clinic that the person is receiving their vaccine from is vaccinating correctly, they should have received their bivalent dose as long as the dose was applied after that date. And that's based on, the FDA, CDC, and ODH criteria. But again, you don't have to use if functions for something that complicated. The general function of an if function is to assign nominal variable names. So you can use it to say, do a COVID at home test survey. If a person reports that they used a BD at home COVID test, then this is the assigned test ID that you can use to report that result to ODH. You can also use your if function to be used in part with VLOOKUP. And there's always going to be different options where some of these formulas have to be combined versus when some of these formulas have to be, kind of drained just a little bit and not be made to be so complicated. Trying to think if we have to get back to this. There's other options you can use with your if functions, such as if the age type is actually equal to years, months, or weeks. Also, something I'd just like to point out to anyone that's working with ODRS data, if you are focusing on age data, keep in mind that something like months, for example, goes all the way up to 11 months for an 11-month-old. So if you're including age as a variable and you're not including that age type in your data download to help control that, you could be including 11-month-olds or anything like that with an improper age group. So like without age type, it's going to categorize everybody by year essentially. So anything less than 11 is going to get categorized out to year 11 or age 0 through 11, and so on and so forth. So just another, nice variable to make sure that you guys have. Here's a pretty simplistic example of how you can use count if again. This is going to return, or it's going to count the number of date reported to local health department individuals that match this date with the corresponding row that are between the ages of 5, or I'm sorry, that are greater than or equal to the ages of 5, and then the age type equals years. So this was a formula that I set up to calculate, again, vaccine age eligible cases. So for something at this point in time, we weren't counting anyone less than 5 on that type of category. It helped us focus on what our case burden was at any given point in time. So if we go back to like May 2021, only individuals 12 years and older could receive the vaccine. So that helps us get a more appropriate age count for individuals that were age eligible or not. So it showed, do we have a disproportionate number of cases who are vaccinated versus or unvaccinated or not? Here we go. Another way that we can apply, I'm going to zoom in so that this doesn't look so overwhelming. Okay. Something else that we can do is count our total number of cases. We can count total cases by their vaccination completed, booster dose, second booster, and bivalent status by using those if and count if functions that we did previously. again, formulas can get really complicated, but as long as you're starting off very basic with, returning our number of females, you can continue to add to this. So if I wanted to do, I want the number of female cases and I want to know how many are vaccinated. It decreases it from 117 down to 71. So that's just a real baseline example of how you can start to use the count if to apply. Your if functions, I think your epis are probably going to be using that more than anyone. You can use it to tell if things are true or false within a data set without, rapidly reviewing all of the data. Within the agenda, I did include several links that I think are really useful for troubleshooting and initially starting these different types of formulas. But the last thing I wanted to touch on before we open it up for questions for everyone is that name manager that we had talked about, because if anyone saw my one formula, it had AGEE. I think it was bag. Yeah. See how my H actually says AGEE. Well, this I should have known about this before I made this code. So once you assign a name to a variable, that is the name for that variable, but you can change it pretty easily. So by going up into, goodness. Sorry, bear with me. I'm formulas. There we go. By going up into formulas and going to name manager, within the spreadsheets that you have open, I'm going to close that so that it doesn't give us 1,000 of them. Because if you have multiple sheets open and you have multiple variables, it gets messy. So by going into formulas and clicking name manager, you can rename these variables as you need to. So let's say you accidentally named something age, or you have something like doses and doses with an extra S for whatever reason. It's very easily to just click and then you can delete said formula. Or if you misnamed something like age type, or if you want to shorten it, you can just, age T. It's as easy as that to change it, and now it'll change it. The only thing I would stress there is if you change it, if you had formulas set up using that variable already, you will have to go update those formulas. So anything, if I would have had anything with age type included, it would mess that up. So just be careful with that if you update any variables. Okay. And then I don't think I'm going to touch on graphs. I'm going to give everyone a chance to ask questions. So for that purpose, I am going to stop the recording.